In 1942, the United States was deep into World War II, thinking its shores were relatively safe. The American people were wrapped up in the war effort, mobilizing forces, rationing food, and preparing for the worst. Though, like most nations at war, they didn't quite expect the enemy to be on their doorstep. The threat, they thought, came from the skies, from bombers and naval forces across the Atlantic. But here's the catch. The Nazis were far more clever than many realized. While the US was busy focusing on its military buildup and thinking of itself as untouchable, Nazi Germany was already planning something far sneakier, more insidious. They were sending spies to American soil, and no one could see it coming. This operation was called Operation Elster, and it would send Nazi agents into the heart of the US, without bombs, tanks, or guns. Just a few men in civilian clothing and a lot of guts. You see, these spies weren't going to land on American shores with a dramatic explosion. Nope. They were coming underwater. U-boats or submarines were Germany's secret weapon during the war. But they were more than just the infamous torpedo-launching monsters we often think of. These were stealth machines, designed to strike silently and disappear just as quickly. They were supposed to slip in unnoticed, travel beneath the waves, and carry out their missions without leaving a trace. And that's exactly what they did. But instead of sinking ships, these U-boats carried something even more dangerous: spies. Now, before we dive deeper into how these U-boats operated, let's ask a simple question. How did these German agents get to the US in the first place? How did they sneak past the watchful eyes of American defenses? It's kind of like if you were throwing a big party and someone slipped in unnoticed, ate all the snacks, and left without you knowing. Except this wasn't a party. It was the US military, and the snacks were America's vital war resources. In June 1942, the Nazis launched their first mission, sending a U-boat right off the coast of Long Island, New York. Long Island, imagine it. A busy, bustling part of the US where people were oblivious to the fact that 4 Nazi agents were about to step onto American soil. To make it even more insane, this was happening only a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So you'd think the US would have been on high alert, right? But no, these spies didn't land in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle or some far-flung corner of America. They landed right under the noses of the American military in one of the busiest places in the country. Here's the real kicker, though. These spies weren't a random group of Germans. They were part of a highly trained espionage network, ready to blend into American society with a plan so well thought out, it almost makes you wonder if the Nazis were secretly running a spy school somewhere. These agents, sent by Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence division, weren't going to start any obvious fights. Instead, their goal was to gather intelligence on American factories, war production facilities, and industrial sites. They were looking for weaknesses in the US supply chain, hoping to sabotage key resources. This wasn't about capturing an American city. It was about destroying the supply lines that kept the war machine running. And get this, they weren't even equipped with fancy gadgets. No James Bond-esque spy cameras or laser pens, just simple civilian clothes, forged documents, and a lot of patience. These spies were trained to observe, blend in, and strike when the time was right. If that isn't creepy enough, their mission was to plant disinformation, spread propaganda, and possibly even cause disruption in the public's perception of the war effort. If you thought Nazi spies sneaking onto US soil in civilian clothes wasn't crazy enough, hold on tight, because this is where it gets even wilder. Picture this. You're standing on the coast of Long Island, with the sun setting over the Atlantic Ocean. The waves are crashing, people are chatting and enjoying their beach day, and you'd have no idea that a giant Nazi submarine is just beneath the surface, gliding silently toward the shore. Now, let's step back a bit and get a full picture of the situation. The Nazis didn't just send spies on ordinary boats or small rafts. They used their U-boats. These weren't your average submarines, the kind you might associate with modern warfare, or even a certain famous Captain Nemo from classic literature. These were deadly Unterseeboote, Germany's war-ready submarines, specifically designed for stealth missions like Operation Elster. But don't be fooled by their sleek design and low profile. These submarines were the horror stories of the Atlantic. They could stay submerged for long periods, launch torpedoes without warning, and most importantly, carry spies to lands that were thought to be safe from invasion. So how exactly did these U-boats sneak onto US soil? That's where things get truly mind-boggling. First off, it's important to understand just how stealthy these U-boats were. Picture this. You're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by warships. And yet, no one can see you. The U-boats would literally disappear into the vastness of the sea, traveling just beneath the surface to avoid detection by any ships above. The Germans had mastered this underwater art, with radar still in its infancy and sonar not quite as advanced as today. They had a window of opportunity to slip right through American defenses. These U-boats weren't just sneaking in with a few spies, though. Oh no, they were carrying highly trained operatives who were ready for action as soon as they hit American soil. And their mission wasn't to storm a city or bomb a port. No, their goal was far subtler, and in many ways even more terrifying. What was the real mission? Let's break it down. The Nazis weren't just looking for any old piece of American intelligence. They wanted the good stuff. These spies were tasked with gathering intel on American military production, specifically munitions factories and industrial sites that were making everything from ammunition to aircraft parts. They were also scouting strategic locations, looking for vulnerabilities in American infrastructure that could be targeted for sabotage. The idea wasn't to blow up a few factories, but to slow down the war production, causing delays and disruptions that would give Germany an edge. But that's not all. These spies were also gathering information about American fortifications, military strategies, and even public opinion. And they were using radio transmissions to send back information to Germany, which they had secretly altered to avoid interception. Imagine the layers of deception here. A spy reports back to his superiors. The message is coded, and then the U-boat has to slip away undetected to pick up the intel. It was like a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, but the stakes were global war. Here's where the U-boat stealth really shines. The Nazis didn't just sail up and drop the spies off in the middle of the night. They were calculated, carefully choosing when and where to land. Long Island, sure. But they also planned to send spies to places like Florida, California, and even Texas, key industrial zones in the US that were producing war materials. Their goal was to make sure that the US military couldn't just focus on its own production, but also had to waste time guarding the coastlines against these infiltration. But here's the real surprise. These U-boats were seldom seen. The Nazis had such a stealth advantage at the time that many of the Americans were completely oblivious. Sure, there were some surface patrols here and there, but they were outnumbered, outmanned, and unaware of just how quiet and deadly these U-boats could be. So why weren't these U-boats detected earlier? Here's where the real danger lies. The US wasn't ready for something like this. Imagine being in the middle of a war, with bombers overhead, and suddenly having to deal with underwater submarines dropping spies on your beaches. It was next-level espionage. The US was focused on fighting the war overseas, and the military wasn't exactly expecting covert missions on its own coastline. This is where the Nazis had the upper hand: stealth and misdirection. The truth is, the US didn't even know that the Germans had a network of spies ready to infiltrate. There were whispers and rumors, but it wasn't until one of the agents defected that the US realized what was happening. You know, it's almost like suddenly realizing you've been playing chess with a grandmaster and you're still stuck on pawn mode. But don't think the Nazis were done yet. Even after the first spies were caught and their mission exposed, the Nazis still had plans in motion. The second wave of U-boats was already headed for more coastal landings. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, so these Nazi spies landed in the US. They almost got away with it, but then they were caught. Big deal. Well, hold your horses, because things are about to take a wild turn. Remember the high-stakes spy mission we've been talking about? Well, here's where the plot thickens, and it's the kind of twist that no one saw coming, not even the Nazis. One of the agents, the one who had been infiltrating America, gathering intel on the US's war resources, betrayed the entire mission. That's right. One of them decided that maybe working for the Nazis wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And here's the best part. This spy wasn't just any ordinary agent. No. This guy was a high-level operative. His name, Friedrich Wilhelm von der Schulenburg. Sounds like a name out of a spy novel, doesn't it? Well, he lived it. So what happened? Friedrich, in an act that can only be described as spying gone rogue, walked right up to the FBI. Yes, you heard that right. He didn't just stay in hiding, shaking with fear. No. He turned himself in. Imagine that moment. A Nazi agent walks into a police station, drops his bag of secrets, and says, "Hey, I'm actually a Nazi spy, and I've got some serious dirt on my mission." Talk about a plot twist. But the real kicker? He didn't just spill the beans about his own operation. He gave up the entire Nazi spy ring that had been infiltrating the US. The guy basically said, "Here's the list, here's the mission, and here's how you can stop the rest of it." If that doesn't sound like the most dramatic spy defection moment you've ever heard of, I don't know what does. But before we get all excited thinking the Nazis' plans were foiled, it's not over yet. You'd think the US would catch a break here, right? Wrong. Even though the authorities were aware of the Nazi spies operating in the US, there were still a lot of moving parts. The Nazis weren't about to let a small defection stop them. Oh no, they had more spies and more U-boats on the way. And what did that mean? It meant that the mission was still in motion, and the threat wasn't entirely shut down. Imagine being part of the Allied forces at the time. You've got a defector on the inside, spilling secret, but you're still racing against time to stop the rest of the Nazi spies from completing their mission. It's like trying to put out a fire while someone keeps pouring gasoline on it. Chaos at its finest. Now, let's dive a little deeper into how Friedrich von der Schulenburg, this unassuming Nazi agent, turned into the hero who brought down the mission. Think about it. Here was a man who went from being a key player in a highly secretive espionage operation, working for one of the deadliest regimes in the world, to a traitor. And what made him do it? Well, the truth is, no one's really sure. Some say he had a moral awakening. Others think he was just looking out for himself, knowing the Nazis were likely to throw him under the bus once the mission was over. Whatever the reason, his actions were the turning point in the story. It was the first real blow to the Nazis' operation. But let's take a minute here. A Nazi spy walking into an FBI office and telling them everything. That's an action movie moment right there. Imagine how intense that must have been, sitting in that office, hearing this man spill the beans on a mission that could have changed the entire outcome of the war. It's the kind of stuff that history books don't talk about. The covert moments that, if not for a single man's choice, could have had entirely different outcomes. And yet, despite the betrayal, the stakes were still sky high. Friedrich had handed over vital intel, but the Nazis weren't finished. They had more agents waiting to land on American soil, and their mission was still very much in play. The US authorities had a race against time to stop the next wave of spies, but by now they were a step ahead, thanks to the intel from the defector. The thing is, when you think about it, this wasn't just an intelligence operation. It was a game of spycraft, a test of wits and patience, and the ultimate gamble. If Friedrich hadn't turned, if he hadn't chosen to betray his mission, who knows what could have happened? The Nazis could have achieved their goal, and the course of history could have been altered in ways we can't even imagine. And here's the twist. Even though Friedrich's defection was a huge win for the Allies, it didn't necessarily mean the Nazis' plans were entirely foiled. The next chapter holds the rest of the story, the aftermath of this betrayal, the secret responses, and what happened after the agents were exposed. Now, here's where you come in, my friend. If you've been following along, you're probably wondering, what happens next? How did the Allies finally manage to shut down the entire Nazi operation? What other secrets were exposed after Friedrich's defection? And just how close did the Nazis come to succeeding? If you're as curious as I am to find out, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because in the next chapter, we'll dive into the final twists of Operation Elster. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. And while you're at it, give us a like if you've been enjoying this wild ride through history. Share this with anyone who loves a good spy story and comment below. We want to hear what you think. Was Friedrich von der Schulenburg a hero, a coward, or just a man trying to save his own skin? Let us know your thoughts.